Tuesday night lecture. This is Tuesday, November 5th, 1985. Brother Francis.
Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen. I'm going to start with you tonight a series of what I call cosmological meditations. As you know, philosophy presupposes wonder. We all had that wonderful virtue when we were children, but most of us have lost it long ago. That doesn't mean that children are necessarily wiser, but at least they spontaneously are seekers after wisdom. But you have to continue that seeking. It cannot just stop. So, if some of these meditations sound very childlike and innocent, don't let that scandalize you. It's a whole new method of approach. I have a whole library here of books on cosmology. I have Aristotle's original book in Greek. I have the greatest book on Philosophia Perennis, I think, that was ever compiled, Gret in Latin. I have books in English, I have books in French. But I have my own method of introducing this subject, and I'm begging you to be patient and to go along with me. We are starting with those meditations, and you should all have 6 sheets of them. If anything is missing, I will supply them later. But I would much rather have you listen to me now than be reading. So just look at me, and your notes are for your purpose after the class. You can review them and see if there is any point there that you missed. I will tell you a few of the tricks of this method. I was very impatient with the way they were teaching philosophy, where they began with logic, which deals with ideas, and then moved into ontology, and the student never noticed that you have moved from the mind to reality. And then they move into cosmology from ontology, and the whole thing is still almost ideas in the mind. So I am trying to start from the ground. As you know, I was very critical of what I call scientism. I spent a great many years in that atmosphere, and my first approach to philosophy was by way of reaction against the false tendencies of scientism. But there is something wholesome about science. At least they keep their feet on the ground. You have to be in the laboratory and smell the H2S, but at least you know you are dealing with something concrete. So I'm starting my course in philosophy with something very concrete. We are all going to be holding in our fingers 1 grain of sand. I could choose a grain of dust, but dust, you have to have a microscope to see it. A grain of sand is still visible. And I'm going to reach many concepts in philosophy, being introduced by thinking with sheer common sense, but with intelligent common sense, about this grain of sand. And when I reach a technical word, and I think that's a better way to introduce a word, is when you are using it meaningfully in a context, than if I gave you a whole series of definitions. I have compiled a list of all these definitions, and sometime I might supply it to you. But if I do it today, I think it will be a distraction. So let us start very simply with a grain of sand. And I'm taking them one by one. One, we can consider the visible universe, the cosmos, as a whole. But let us consider first the things that make it up. If we study a human child, a bird, a flower, and a grain of sand, we would have exhausted the types of all the things which make up the visible universe. Let us begin with the simplest of these, the grain of sand. Notice, the grain of sand is a mineral. The flower is a vegetable, is a plant. The bird is an animal, the philosopher says, a sentient being. a being endowed with sense perception, and then a child, a human being, intelligence. But we are beginning with the simplest item. Now, if once you have had that list, the whole visible universe, that doesn't include the angels, that will be a separate item. Our universe is much larger than the universe of the scientists, because they can only deal with the material universe. If you examine these items, every single thing in the world is represented in these 5 items. So we are going to have a cosmological meditation on every one of them. We can study a grain of sand in such a way as to make it represent not only every other grain of sand, but also every other sensible object, from the remotest star to the smallest drop of water. Even things like the child, the bird, and the flower could be represented by that grain if we ignore or prescind from, that's a technical word, you see how it's used, prescind from, that's, don't pay attention to it, but you don't, it still could be there. If you take a little rabbit from a high window and let it go, it would fall just as a bag of potatoes would fall, just as a stone would fall. It's a living thing, but in that behavior you prescind from life. You are treating it as a natural material body that has weight. That's what we mean by prescind. When we study it in this manner, even though we are talking materially about a grain of sand, formally we are considering a more abstract object, or to put it in other words, we are considering a grain of sand under a more abstract formality. Namely, we are considering it as a natural body. So now we have the subject of cosmology, a natural body. The whole universe is made up of natural bodies. We will find eventually what is the unit. But taking the whole world completely, that's what it is finally resolved into. And under that one abstract concept, when we prescind from intelligence, sensation, and life, we are dealing then with the whole material universe, but from that one point of view, as a natural body. Of such approach is cosmology, the part of philosophy which studies the order of nature, the visible universe, by prescinding from the fact of life. But since for beginners in philosophy abstraction can be a repellent, while continuing to deal with my grain of sand as a natural body, I am going to continue calling it a grain of sand. So if you can make the adjustment in your mind, when I say something about it, you would say, supposing I had not a grain of sand, but the whole moon, if I were holding the whole moon in my hand, would you still say the same thing about it? Sometimes there might have to be something adaptedly, but corresponding to the same truth. This grain of sand has a recognizable nature. So that is a very crucial word there, because sometimes cosmology is called the philosophy of nature. And what do we mean by nature? Now, that's one of the most valuable terms for thought. We couldn't think without it. So we are encountering it now on the first acquaintance with it. We are going to need it in theology. It's a very valuable term for theology. We speak about the two natures in our Lord, the hypostatic union, the union of two natures in one person. We speak about three persons in the one nature of God. So it's a very valuable notion. But before we give an abstract definition, let us start using it intelligently. So this grain of sand has a recognizable nature. It acts, it resists, it can be acted upon in a definite and dependable way, which it shares with all other grains of sand. I looked up the word in the concordance today, and I found that almost every book in Holy Scripture, sand is mentioned. Now, some of the people who give you the idea that this universe is a kind of like a dream, or just a flow, everything changing, we say, how can you explain that when we hear from the book of Genesis, the most ancient book we have, a reference to sand, we know that it means to us exactly what it meant to Moses or to Abraham. So there must be some foundation in reality that's not just sheer flux or sheer indefinite vagueness. If any one of us could make a series of all the dreams we ever had, they would be completely subjective and personal, and they would be completely unrelated to anybody else's dreams. But this universe is common, objective. It's our universe. That's why we have language. We can talk about it. And while this grain may be destroyed and may have not existed from before some point in time, still there must be a tendency in reality to produce and to preserve that nature, so that as long as men have been talking, they have always talked about sand. This is a matter for wonder to an intelligent mind. This fact alone refutes some philosophic errors. The visible universe cannot be reduced to a process of mere indeterminate, unintelligible, inexpressible change. You remember one of the students of Heraclitus, a sophist by the name of Gorgias, who said, there is no truth. Even if there were, nobody can know it. And even if anybody knew it, he could not tell it to anybody else. Now we call these the three arch denials, negations of bad, destructive thought. The truth is that there is truth, and it is knowable, and it can be expressed. These are the exact opposites are the foundations of Philosophia Perennis. And it begins with that stability we have in a grain of sand. How is it that grains individually can be destroyed, dissolved, turned into something else, they can be absorbed? When you put a small seed of any kind of a tree in a garden, and then in a few years you find tons of that tree spreading throughout where did the matter come from? It's all different little entities like a grain of sand that have been absorbed and turned into a cedar or an oak or a pine or whatever. But there is a tendency in nature to continue producing grains of sand. And as long as men have been talking, they have been always talking about sand, and they have been talking about the same thing. That's why it's so thrilling for us to read the ancient books, to discover that community of intelligence, that objectivity that we share with men of the ancient times. 4. Our senses can perceive only an amount of sand present here and now, but our mind apprehends in that sand a universal nature, not limited in space and time. So we are introducing now what we mean by a universal. The particle of sand in my finger here is very little, but the moment the mind gets that concept, it gets an ocean that takes in millions of tons, maybe some in Africa, some in Australia, some anywhere. Wherever that nature exists, I could be talking about it, and if I say something truthful about it, it applies to all these others. Now, universalizing, which we discovered in our course of logic, is essential for intelligence and for reasoning, is the way a spiritual intelligence is protected when it is bound to material reality. It simplifies, you see? It simplifies out of this tremendous multiplicity of things, one monosyllable represents them to the intelligence. Every grain of sand has a size. If that size were infinite, sand would be the only material reality. When the ocean stops, it has to be stopped by something that's not ocean, see? If the same nature continued indefinitely, there would be no place for anything else. It keeps pushing itself right to the limits. So we know what we mean now by a finite thing. A grain of sand is a finite thing. If there were an infinite number of grains of sand, there would have been at least one substance not ordered in number, measure, and weight. There exists a very large number of grains of sand, but not an infinite number. So not only the size of every grain is finite, but the number of grains is finite. Now, Holy Scripture very often uses sand to indicate an exaggerated large number, as when he promised Abraham that he will be blessed so that his descendants will be like the sand on the seashore. Now, that's an exaggeration, but no matter how big that number is, it's not infinite. Infinity does not exist except in the material world, except by way of potency. Do you get that point? Now, this is one of the foundations that we are going to realize more and more, and we'll be referring to it. Nobody ever counted to an infinite number. But once you see that you can continue, you know there is no numerical wall, so to speak. You see, that's the number, and you can go beyond that. As a child once, somebody challenged me by the idea that most probably no human being ever counted up to 1,000,000. And I got the idea that I was going to do it. And I started counting. And when I got tired or stopped, I marked the last number I mentioned. In those years, one of my duties was to go and get the milk for the family. And they had to walk about 2-3 miles in the mountains and valleys and so on. And after going through several weeks and months and finding that I was still way down on the scale, I then sat down and calculated how long it would take to really count the million. So to make the calculation sometime, you'll find out. But what's a million? Today, a million is nothing. We talk about billions, billions of billions. And yet all these are numbers. They are not infinite. Now, this is a little realization. You see, the purpose of this is an introduction to cosmology. This is the wonder that the philosophers say you cannot become a philosopher until you have done it. It's appreciation, you see. So just to appreciate that even though there is a tremendously large number of grains of sand, God knows their number and it's not infinite. And the existence of every one of them is due to the will of God. God willed that little particle to exist. Otherwise, it wouldn't be. The difference between act and potency is very important there. No human mind knows an infinite number of propositions, of truths. But the potency is infinite. There's no time you say his mind is full, he can't know anything anymore. See? It's that thing we express with the BLE at the end of the word. It's knowability. It's not known, but knowability. It's not divided, but divisible. Those paradoxes of Zeno we were talking about the other day were all due to the confusion of divisible with divided. No road is divided into an infinite number of parts, but every dimension considered abstractly is divisible into an infinite number of parts. So these are and what are we touching now? The most fundamental metaphysical concepts, act and potency. And what's the definition of a being that we are studying in this course of cosmology? We are studying a being that's always in potency. Every natural body is by definition a being in potency. And when we realize that meaning fully, we see why no natural body can explain itself, that all natural bodies must lead to a being that is pure act. But I have not proved it yet. I am just learning vocabulary that will lead us to that. Every grain of sand. Okay, so there exists a very large number of grains of sand, but not an infinite number. Now we are going to learn that one of the most fundamental principles of Philosophia Perennis is the one that insists that what exists has to be an individual substance, what the philosophers call first substance. I will explain the meaning of first in that sentence. As I say, some of the most important words in philosophy are the simplest words, which we take for granted. Individual substance. At this moment, there is a tremendous number of individual substances. Some molecules of water, other molecules of oxygen, other molecules of iron, others of gold, others of maybe quanta of energy. A tremendous large number, but not an infinite number. And every one of those entities is contributing its part to make the world what it is, which is another tremendous realization. When we deal with sand, we are usually dealing with a multitude, a great number together, like a sand beach. All the properties of a sand beach are rooted in the natures of the individual grains. All the forest is in the trees. So most of the realities we deal with are composed of collections, groups, and so on. But the natures, the way they behave, are rooted eventually in the individual entities that have a very definite nature. That's the root. All the properties of a sand beach are grounded, foundationed in that consistent nature that we talked about of every grain of sand. That's another tremendous philosophic realization. Every grain of sand may be destroyed. For example, every grain of sand may dissolve and become absorbed and assimilated in a living tree. Any chemist can tell you that you could take a little body of sand and turn it into something else by acids, by getting into combination. We know that sand is one of the things that produce glass. Now when glass is there, it's no more sand, it becomes glass. So any grain of sand can be destroyed. But as long as it lasts, it will continue faithfully to behave in accordance with its sand nature. Number 8. Now this is to me, was one of the most thrilling insights. When I got it, I was so excited. If every grain of sand in the world could lose its nature and start behaving like, for example, drops of water, supposing that would happen. Supposing suddenly every grain of sand in this world made up its mind to behave like a drop of water. Do you see the consequence? If every grain of sand in the world could lose its nature and start behaving like, let us say, drops of water, the continents would collapse and life on earth would become impossible, and that would be the end of this lecture. And we will. Now, just stop enough to realize that. So, does that mean that we should thank that grain of sand for being so faithful to the nature God gave it? Yes, we should. Our very existence, all civilization, everything you have, is in one way dependent on the faithfulness of this grain of sand to the nature God gave it. Do we begin to perceive a little bit that the mind of God, to whom that grain of sand owes its very existence, intended also that it will make it possible for the continents to exist and for human beings to live and to learn how to know Him and how to love Him? We are beginning to see a little bit into very much greater heights already. So, if there is a consistent universe with nature we can count upon, we go to sleep knowing there is going to be another day, the sun will rise, everything. It's not only the one grain of sand. You see, the grain of sand there represents every particle of air. If every molecule of oxygen and of nitrogen were to change its nature, how long will we last? Supposing they start behaving like, supposing the oxygen turn into hydrogen and the nitrogen into some poisonous gas. Well, that will be the end of us in a minute. Now that realization, that how much everything in this world is dependent on the natures of things. So when we use the word nature now with some realization of its tremendous significance. Therefore, every grain of sand is doing its part in restraining the oceans and sustaining the conditions for life. Human intelligence cannot produce one grain of sand unless it discovers a real potency in other existing things which the human intelligence cannot produce either. Another realization. You could look at that small grain of sand now that you realize that our very existence depends on what it is and its faithfulness to its nature and consistently staying within it until it is destroyed. And then you realize for the first time that not all the laboratories of the world could produce one grain of sand on their own. Not one grain of sand. Do you begin to sense what creation means? Only the omnipotence of God could have given existence to that essence. Anybody could study its properties, get an idea of what it is, describe its nature and so on. But that is there, the being. Remember we said once, it's much more important that the cow is a being than that it is a cow. What makes it an existing entity? That's the most exciting thing about it. And that the mind, when it starts thinking correctly, will see that it can only come from a mind also. Why a mind? because we already discovered how much purpose, intelligibility, meaning is there. Now that could never have come except from a mind. But it's a mind not like our mind. Our mind can only discover these things, but it can't give them existence. They can only get existence from the one who said, I am who am. I am existence, and nothing can exist except as it gets it from me. All right. Number 11, human intelligence is inventive in the strict sense of being capable of discovering the potentialities of what is already in existence. We have a feast in the calendar called the invention of the true cross. And people who don't know any Latin make a joke of it, that they think that it's something they invented in the silly conversational sense of the word. Well, invention in Latin means the coming upon. It really means the discovery. The human mind, when we speak about the human mind as creative, we talk about the creative arts, we only use it metaphorically. The human mind can't create anything, but the human mind can discover. Human intelligence is inventive in the strict sense of being capable of discovering the potentialities of what's already in existence. But in the absolute sense, human intelligence is not at all creative. So that's another term that we need. What do you mean by creation? See? 12. If intelligibility is discoverable in the things of the visible universe, and the existence of the sciences and the arts proves that it is, then it must be due to an intelligence which bears a different relation to the existence of things than our intelligence, an intelligence on which the existence and the intelligibility of things depend, and not vice versa. Our knowledge depends on what things are, and that's how we get what we call truth, which is conformity of mind to reality. But with God, the reality conforms to the mind. We know them because they are, but they are because God knew them first. There is such an intelligence, and its name is God. So this is our first cosmological meditation, in which some of the fundamental notions we are going to need in ontology have somehow arisen spontaneously, and they are not up in the sky, they are not sheer abstraction. We are constantly talking about this little grain of sand. And this little grain of sand on my finger here is representing the moon, the stars, all the tons of iron and gold, because I could have been saying the same thing about every one of them, under that formality, prescinding from any other aspect except the aspect of a natural body with a definite nature. So I will stop here. On the line, are we connected? Along the line of our preparing ourselves for scientific cosmology, so to speak, for philosophic cosmology, I am going to the field of science and see if a person in that field could still find occasions that could begin to bring him up to the considerations of a higher philosophic order. Because after all, science is still dealing with reality, and all he has to do is just take time off to begin to meditate on the facts before him. So I will read as much of this as we can read together, and you can finish it on your own, because I might have some comments to make. It's written by a scientist called A. Cressy Morrison. Does anybody recognize him? I'm glad that somebody recognized General Sarnoff. We are still in the dawn of the scientific age, and every increase of light reveals more brightly the handiwork of an intelligent creator. We have made stupendous discoveries with a spirit of scientific humility and of faith grounded in knowledge. We are approaching ever nearer to an awareness of God. For myself, I count 7 reasons for my faith. Now, I'm not going to be just negatively critical at the start. I mean, first, what he's talking about is not faith at all. You don't have 7 scientific reasons for your faith. I mean, he's not using the word faith in the right sense. So ignore all these, you might call them childish things. There is still something positive in this article, and let us go after that. Like the wise bee that goes for the honey and just ignores anything that's there in the way. First, by unwavering mathematical law, we can prove that our universe was designed and executed by a great engineering intelligence. Now, you know the Masonic concept of the great architect, that's Manichaean. An architect or an engineer or an artisan cannot work without matter. And so that presupposes the concept that God is an intelligence, benevolent intelligence, but working with something that it finds there and trying to do the best it can with that. Well, that's not our word, that's not our faith. God put in existence everything, matter and form. But however, still, one of the main foundations of the mentality we meet today, especially among educated people, and the more educated, the worse. This idea of chance. They all have that prejudice that got out of evolution. That God just splashed a whole ocean of electrons and started floating around under their laws of electrical attraction and repulsion and about gravity and all that. And billions of years going on, and God wanted to see what's going to come out of them. And in those things where every tree, every flower, every bee, they were somehow potentially there, but wait until by chance this thing emerges. So what can you do with chance? Left chance to itself, just an impersonal universe with nothing but the laws of physics and chemistry and biology eventually. And what will come out of them? So he said, suppose you put 10 pennies marked from 1 to 10 into your pocket and give them a good shuffle. Now try to take them out in sequence from 1 to 10, putting back the coin each time and shaking them all again. Mathematically we know that your chance of first drawing number 1 is 1 in 10. If you have 10 numbers, you shake them, and therefore it's just a matter of chance. You put your hand, and you take a number, and what's the chance of getting 1 out of the 10? 1 in 10, right? What's the chance that you get 1 and 2 in the order? 1 out of 100. The chance of getting 1 out of 10 the first time is 10, is 1 in 10, and the chance that it should follow in every one of those 1 in 10, there's only another 1 in 10, so it's 1 in 100 the next time. You have to figure it out, but I assure you that is correct. Now try to take them out in sequence from 1 to 10, putting back the coin each time and shaking them all again. Mathematically we know that your chance of first drawing number 1 is 1 in 10, of drawing 1 and 2 in succession, 1 in 100, of drawing 1, 2 and 3 in succession, 1 in 1,000, and so on. Your chance of drawing them all from number 1 to number 10 in succession would reach the unbelievable figure of 1 in 10 billion. Now that's how much chance can produce a definite order. But in the little finger of a child, there is not only a million times, but almost an infinity more order than in drawing 10 numbers in a definite order. And if that comes by chance. So, I mean, it does give you something. You say we need to have some sense of wonder before we can begin to grow philosophically. Well, that's one of the things. At least puts chance in its place. Now, in those notes that I call the cosmology of faith and revelation, I have quotations, and those notes are the most important thing we have. I just introduced them to you, but at the end of the course I am going back and we are going to do them very thoroughly. Chance is something human, but Holy Scripture teaches us that even when you tumble them and you think you are drawing by chance, the providence of God is still operative there, and to God there is no such thing as chance. Now that is a very hard thing to realize, but so is the omnipotence and the omniscience of God, and the universal providence, the particular providence of God. These are not easy things to realize. By the same reasoning, so many exacting conditions are necessary for life on the earth that they could not possibly exist in proper relationship by chance. The earth rotates on its axis 1,000 miles an hour at the equator. That's correct. As the earth rotates on its axis, if you could be independent of that motion, watching it from the space, every point of the equator is moving at the speed of 1,000 miles an hour all the time. If it turned at 100 miles an hour, our days and nights would be 10 times as long as now, and the hot sun would likely burn up our vegetation each long day, while in the long night any surviving sprout might well freeze. Again, the sun, source of our life, has a surface temperature of 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and our earth is just far enough away so that this eternal fire warms us just enough and not too much. If the sun gave off only one half its present radiation, we would freeze, and if it gave half as much more, we would roast. The slant of the earth, tilted at an angle of 23 degrees, I think it's 23 and a half, gives us our seasons. If the earth had not been so tilted, vapors from the ocean would move north and south, piling up for us continents of ice. If our moon were, say, only 50,000 miles away instead of its actual distance, our tides might be so enormous that twice a day all continents would be submerged. Even the mountains could soon be eroded away. If the crust of the earth had been only 10 feet thicker, there would be no oxygen, without which animal life must die. Had the ocean been a few feet deeper, carbon dioxide and oxygen would have been absorbed and no vegetable life could exist. It is apparent from these and a host of other examples that there is not one chance in billions that life on our planet is an accident. Now, that's only the opening door. I mean, if you start to consider, or just imagine the delicate balance that requires billions of things being just right for our existence to last for 1 minute. And imagine it going on for thousands of years. And even when we say thousands of years, we are the modest people who believe in creation. For them, billions and billions of years. And always that balance. What in the world keeps it? Just the laws of chemistry and physics? Just by chance? Second, the resourcefulness of life to accomplish its purpose is a manifestation of an all-pervading intelligence. Now, I'm not going to read this whole thing. I don't think I have enough time. How much time do I still have? 50 minutes? Okay. All right. What life itself is, no man has fathomed. It has neither weight nor dimensions, but it does have force. A growing root will crack a rock. Life has conquered water, land, and air, mastering the elements, compelling them to dissolve and reform their combinations. Life, the sculptor, shapes all living things. An artist, it designs every leaf of every tree and colors every flower. Life is a musician and has taught each bird to sing its love song, the insects to call one another in the music of their multitudinous sounds. Life is a sublime chemist, giving taste to fruits and spices, and perfume to the rose, changing water and carbonic acid into sugar and wood, and in so doing releasing oxygen that animals may have the breath of life. Behold an almost invisible drop of protoplasm, transparent, jelly-like, capable of motion, drawing energy from the sun. This single cell, this transparent mist-like droplet, holds within itself the germ of life and has the power to distribute this life to every living thing, great and small. The powers of this droplet are greater than our vegetation and animals and people, for all life came from it. Nature did not create life. Fire, blistered rocks, and a saltless sea could not meet the necessary requirements. Who then has put it here? Third, now this is one of my favorites here. I mean, I don't say that you can prove the existence of God from an observation like that. I don't say that you need that kind of observation to reason to the truth of God. But it is kind of calling for wonder. The animal wisdom speaks irresistibly of a good creator who infused instinct into otherwise helpless little creatures. The young salmon spends years at sea, then comes back to its own river and travels up the very side of the river into which flows the tributary where he was born. What brings him back so precisely? If you transfer him to another tributary, he will know at once that he is off his course, and he will fight his way down and back to the main stream, and then turn up against the current to finish his destiny accurately. Even more difficult to solve is the mystery of eels. These amazing creatures migrate at maturity from ponds and rivers everywhere, those from Europe across thousands of miles of ocean, all bound for the same abysmal deeps near Bermuda. There they breed and die. The little ones, with no apparent means of knowing anything except that they are in a wilderness of water, nevertheless start back and find their way not only to the very shore from which their parents came, but thence to the self-same river. Rivers, lakes, or little ponds. No American eel has ever been caught in Europe, no European eel in America. Nature has even delayed the maturity of the European eel by a year or more to make up for its longer journey. Where does the directing impulse originate? Now, you don't have to study the eels, but I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I don't think you would put them there unless they were scientifically observed. When you see those migrating birds, you know, what makes them know what way to go? I mean, you say they go in the direction where it will be warmer in winter. Well, how do they know? I mean, on the spot here, there's very little difference in temperature between the north side of the room and the south side of the room. What made them know where to go? I mean, there are certainly tremendous wonders. I mean, you can't say that's the intelligence of the bird, because they obviously have no intelligence. Have no, even the greatest scientist or astronomer wouldn't know how to do it unless he was directed by some other device. How do they know how to do it? So there is intelligence at work. I mean, it's only a man who does not use his mind the way God intended him to use his intelligence that will never find anything exciting or elevating or pointing in the direction of knowing the ultimate cause of things. Man has something more than animal instinct, the power of reason, etc. Well, fifth, provision for all living is revealed in such phenomena as the wonders of genes. Another, by the economy of nature, we are forced to realize that only infinite wisdom could have foreseen and prepared with such astute husbandry. Many years ago, a species of cactus was planted in Australia as a protective fence. Having no insect enemies in Australia, the cactus soon began a prodigious growth. The alarming abundance persisted until the plants covered an area as long and wide as England, crowding inhabitants out of the towns and villages and destroying their farms. Seeking a defense, entomologists scoured the world. Finally, they turned up an insect which lived exclusively on cactus and would eat nothing else. It would breed freely too, and it had no enemies in Australia. So animals soon conquered vegetable, and today the cactus pest has retreated, and with it all but a small protective residue of the insects, enough to hold the cactus in check forever. So all this nature balancing nature, all this marvelous providence, I mean, even on the lowest level, the mind begins to discover it. Such checks and balances have been universally provided. Why have not fast-breeding insects dominated the earth? Because they have no lungs such as man possesses. They breathe through tubes. But when insects grow large, their tubes do not grow in ratio to the increasing size of the body. Hence, there never has been an insect of great size. This limitation on growth has held them all in check. If this physical check had not been provided, man could not exist. Imagine meeting a hornet as big as a lion. Seventh, the fact that man can conceive the idea of God is in itself a unique proof. The conception of God rises from a divine faculty of man, unshared with the rest of our world. The faculty we call imagination. Now, his thinking now and his terminology are completely false. Imagination can only deal with material things. You cannot imagine God. If you imagine God, you have a false God. By its power, man and man alone can find the evidence of things unseen. The vista that power opens up is unbounded. Indeed, as man's perfected imagination becomes a spiritual reality, he may discern in all the evidence of design and purpose, the great truth that heaven is wherever and whatever, that God is everywhere and in everything, and nowhere so close as in our hearts. So there is some innocent piety there, but with very, very confused concepts. It is scientifically as well as imaginatively true, as the psalmist said, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. So I didn't want to read the whole thing because it's tiring, but you have the whole article, you can take it at your leisure. And you will discover that even a scientist, when he begins to reflect and do some meditation, gets started on the way towards philosophy and wisdom. Nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus. Sedes sapientiae, nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen.
The St. Augustine Institute of Catholic Studies presents Brother Francis with his regular Tuesday night lecture. This is Tuesday, November 12th, 1985. Brother Francis.
De Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus. Auxilium Christianorum, sedes sapientiae, Sancte Martine. Nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen. I am going to continue our meditation of last week on the subject of the little grain of sand I am holding in my fingers. Before I begin this next section, I want to ask a question now. This is not printed, and so don't look at your notes. This little grain of sand must have started to exist at some time. Has it always been? Was it created? It is a creature, definitely. Everything that's not God is a creature. Was it created at something like 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago? No, in some sense it has always been. Holy Scripture says all things were created together. The very first act of creation placed in existence all material reality, and we believe also all spiritual reality at the same time. So in some sense it has always existed, but not as a grain of sand. Do you get that realization fully? It could have been part of a living tree. It could have been part of some solution in water. It could be something of any kind of sort. But all the conclusions of science, as well as all our human experience, indicates that as long as we are dealing with the material world, something always remains the same. But something also does not remain the same. I am leading now to two very important words that represent very real concepts. A little bit of technical terminology is required in every discipline, and we will be getting some of these terms in every class. I think you would agree with me that little grain of sand has always existed as far as its matter is concerned. But as far as the individual substance that is in my finger, it has not always existed. If you get a full realization of what I'm talking about, you will understand one of the most important ideas of true cosmology, the idea of prime matter. So I'll be introducing this idea tonight. If that's the only thing we learn, we would have learned something. We have schools of false philosophy that tell us all reality is nothing but matter. And anything that's not matter is just nothing. We also have other false philosophies that tell us that matter is not real, has no reality whatsoever. Everything is just ideas, it's all in the mind. Philosophia perennis, the true sound philosophy that we defend, avoids both errors completely. Matter is real, but it's not the only reality. And one of the things we have to learn in a course in philosophy is what kind of reality is matter. We have to be able to think intelligently and correctly about matter. That's part of the wisdom. So we are trying to acquire these two important concepts, prime matter and substantial form. And I will continue to talk, sometimes very clumsily, but hopefully in the end we will arrive at a real apprehension of what these two concepts mean. And I don't want our course ever to become just a matter of words. I don't want to be using a word until we all agree that it is objectively real. We are talking about reality. So the other term you find on the board that I will try to explain is the word hylomorphism. If you ask a technical philosopher What is the philosophy of St. Thomas and the scholastic philosophers? The philosophy that at one time all the Catholic universities were teaching. As regards the material universe, they will tell you it's the philosophy of hylomorphism. It sounds like a strange word, but it's a very simple, innocent word. It's made up of two Greek words, hule, which means matter, and morphe, which means form. Now we all think we know what we mean by matter and by form, but when we use these terms in philosophy, what we know about them will never be completely destroyed, but will have to be deepened. Our concept of matter and of form has to become much deeper than the way we have been using those terms. In connection with matter, we use the word prime matter, and you have heard that word used. And prime simply means first, and another word which we think we know what it means when we say first and second. But as we use that term in philosophy, again, it has a very much deeper sense than when we use it in ordinary conversation. And we find it on the board tonight in two ways. We speak of first substance and second substance, and we also speak of first matter or prime matter and second matter. So I am going to continue talking about these things, always thinking about this little grain of sand that I'm holding in my finger. I want the whole thing to be in the order of concrete things, like a grain of sand, instead of beginning with definitions and then you think that the whole thing is abstract. Now let me see how we use the word first substance and second substance. I talked about finding the word sand in the book of Genesis. God tells Abraham, your seed shall be like the sand by the sea. If you can count the sand by the sea, you can count them. And we feel right away that there is a rapport between our mind and the mind of the inspired author who was reporting that incident, which took place about 4,000 years ago. Right away we know that he's talking about the same thing we understand by the word sand. Now, Abraham was not holding this same identical grain of sand that I'm holding in my finger. It probably did not exist then. It probably was part of some huge tree or some huge rock or dissolved in the ocean or something like that. So that grain of sand in my finger here did not exist then. But sand existed then, and it meant exactly what it means today. Sand, as we talk about it this way, is a universal. It's a universal idea. And we will be talking in philosophy all the time about what do we mean by the universals and to what extent they are real. The individual particle in my finger is an individual. So you get now the distinction between universal and individual. Between the two great Greek philosophers, Plato was fascinated by the universals. He called them the ideas. And to him, they were much more real than the individual grain of sand that I hold in my finger. And that applied to everything. The idea man that a philosopher could write a book about it, and even if he wrote it in the 6th century BC, he is still talking about man as we know the word now, as it applies to every one of us. To Plato, that's much more important than the men who live and die and disappear. The sparrows that the poets were talking about in the Greek centuries, we still talk about the sparrows, and we know what it means. Every individual sparrow lives and dies, but somehow the sparrows go on. So Plato discovered the realm of ideas, the realm of universals, was tremendously excited about it, but exaggerated its status in reality. And so we have had philosophers all through the centuries falling into that, in some sense, attractive form of error, exaggerating the reality of ideas. Aristotle, his student, saw the fallacy of that. He insisted that the most real things are the individuals, not men, not humanity, but John and James and Peter, this man and that man and that man, this grain of sand existing. So in the language of Aristotle, which we accept as true philosophy, while we condemn Platonism as an error, we say that before we can have substance in the sense in which we use it as a universal, like we talk about the sand at the time of Abraham and the sand today, there has to be the individual substances that bear the nature of sand. And if these individual substances did not exist, the universal will automatically not exist. In that perspective, we speak of the individual as first substance, of the universal as second substance. And you get a sense now of how the philosophers use the word first and second. In every order, what is second depends for being what it is on what is first in that same order. If there were not first substances, there would be no second substance. We get a very good sense of that, and the poets as well as the philosophers like to use the sun as a first in all the things that depend on the sun. The sun is the first illuminator when it is shining in the day. We get illumination not merely directly from the sun. Everything becomes an illuminator. The trees reflect the light with their beautiful colors, and the flowers and the walls and the water, and everything is an illuminator. These are second illuminators. What is the first illuminator? The sun. Stop the light of the sun, automatically you stop the light of all these second illuminators. So you see, it's not a second and first in the sense of saying, and then what is third and what is fourth, and go on counting. It's a kind of dependence. We call that metaphysical dependence. And the name, every time you discover that type of dependence, we call it order. So that's another concept that's very common. We think we all understand what it means, but you will be surprised how much we will find that we can grow in its appreciation when this course is over. What do we really mean by order? Every time you have order, you have a first and a second, in such a way that what is second depends for being what it is on what is first. I could use the sun in another sense as a cause. Think how the movement of the sun to our hemisphere, when it has crossed the equator and is now shining from that celestial circle that's the extension of our equator, on our side of it, on the side of the north. That's one event. The movement of the sun is one simple event. But that is a cause. A cause of what? Of millions and millions of things that start to happen. The flowers start, the plants start budding, the flowers start opening, the different activities in the air, the birds behave differently, grass starts coming up, the different temperature. Every single thing is happening dependent on that first cause. All these millions of activities are second causes. So we do have right in our own order an expression to give us the notion of what we mean by a first cause and second causes. In our own experience, I read you once that classical passage where Socrates was illustrating to his disciples the difference, that's what he was really explaining there, the difference between second causes and a first cause. Now, when we use that word for first cause, we can use it in an absolute sense where it can apply to only one being, and that is God. But if we didn't have anything in a lower order that even analogously points in that direction, the word would mean nothing to us. We couldn't even apply it analogously to God. So take my mind in relation to the things that I decide in my head and do with the rest of my body. In my head, in my mind, it's not in the head really, it's not located, it's not organic. Some philosophic principles, illustrations going on, decisions being made. As a result of that, my hand is moving up and down. I could take a walk back and forth. You can start analyzing these activities and you find an infinity almost of second causes at work. Why did this bone move up there? Because this muscle pushed at it, contracted. Why did it contract? Because something else happened. You see the second causes at work? But you go back to the mind and there's the first cause. That's why the man is walking. See? So God gave us in our own order something by which we can, some stepping stones. Now people who have never done this kind of analysis think when you give you these stupid answers. Who made the world? God made the world. Who made God? So you think that the thing is going to go on ad infinitum, When we study the material world intelligently, we find the kind of being that needs a cause. And when we find the notion of a first cause, we have moved out into a whole new order. It's not just still saying, and this pushed that, and this pushed that, and what pushed this last one, and that will go on ad infinitum. But it's moving into a new order when you go from what is second to what is first. So all these are still preliminaries. We are just cultivating a vocabulary. So let me go back now and review. Before I review these words that you find on the board, to see if we get some initial understanding of what they mean. And don't be discouraged if you don't get it absolutely clear tonight, because these are going to be with us throughout the course, and we'll be coming back to them from different angles. But it's good to know that these are very important terms to begin to understand. I want to take one other notion and then relate it to these other notions on the board. The notion of substantial change. So we go back now to our concept of change. And remember, the course we are studying is the study of, what's the subject of the course we are taking now? Ens mobile, which means a being that is changing, a being in change. Aristotle, who is the scientific founder of philosophy, studied change in the 10 categories, which he is the genius to name in the first place. All reality has to be either substance or accident. So that notion of substance is a very important notion, and every time we talk about it, we get some new light. The difference between a substance and an accident is the difference between a being that exists in itself and a being that exists in another. The tree is substance, but the color of the tree is an accident. You don't have green just floating, just green. Green what? Green nothing, just green. You don't have that. You don't have headaches without heads. Headaches are an accident, heads are substance. the grain of sand I'm holding in my finger, that's substance. But its weight, its color, its position, all these are accidents. Now, you know there are 9 accidents, and I think when we studied logic, we could name all of them. Quantity, first substance, all by itself. And then, in opposition to that, 9 accidents. Quantity, quality, relation, action, passion, time, place, disposition, and happiness. Aristotle analyzed the notion of change in terms of these 9 accidents, and he discovered that significantly a change occurs in 4 of them. And they are place, quantity, quality, and substance. Now, place. What do we call change when it is just a matter of change of place? Locomotion. The word loco means local, place, and motion. When one body moves from place to another. Locomotion. That's the least important kind of change, but it is there. The second is quantity. We see a tree, very small, and then a few years later we come and we find a big tree. It's the same substance, the same individual substance, first substance, you see. But it has changed its quantity, it's much bigger. Quality. We are all familiar with all the quality changes that take place in the fall. The same trees we used to see, green and full of leaves and so on. Now we look at them and we have that marvelous display of color, and then very soon no color at all. Just all these are qualitative changes. Quality. In persons, a person was ignorant, now he is learned. Between a person who doesn't know any algebra and one who has had a course, there is a difference of quality. So these are the 3 changes significantly that take place in the 3 categories of quantity, quality, and place. There remains the most fundamental and the most important change in substance. Does that also take place? And of course, without having to study physics or chemistry or even philosophy, we all know that change of substance does take place. In the case of living things, death is a change of substance. 1 minute and the person is a living man, and another minute and you have a corpse. You can't say the corpse is a man. It's what's left when the man is gone. That's substantial change. We know from our scientific courses, water can be dissolved, can be synthesized, analyzed into oxygen and hydrogen, 2 gases. Not one of them is water or behaves like water or has the same nature as water. And when water has disappeared, you certainly have to say there has been a change in the substance of things. That is substantial change. It's a fact. I could take a piece of paper and I could change its shape. I could change its color. I can do all kinds of things to it, but it's still paper. I burn it and I destroy its substance. I will be left with ashes, with smoke, with other things, vapor maybe, but there's no more paper. That's substantial change. For those of you who have had courses in both physics and chemistry, I could tell you now that even the scientists who did not know how to express it philosophically, when they distinguish between what belongs to physics and what belongs to chemistry, it's precisely on the issue of substantial change. All the changes that physics study are accidental. It studies falling bodies, but the body is still the body, and so on. That's the law of falling bodies. When you study how the specific heat of a substance, it's cold, then you heat it, but it's still iron. But when iron rusts, there's no more iron. Substantial change has taken place, and rusting is a phenomenon we study not in physics, but in chemistry. So the philosophic distinction between what belongs to physics and what belongs to chemistry is precisely the distinction between substantial change and accidental change. Now, in every kind of change, when we try to analyze it intelligently, there has to be a starting point, a terminal point, and a subject that undergoes the two. Otherwise, there will be something that our mind absolutely refuses to allow to be possible, and that is annihilation and springing up to existence out of sheer nothing. Now, the philosophers could not conceive creation because they could not conceive a being coming from non-being or a being going into non-being. But that's because they did not have the concept of the first cause, the omnipotent creator. So in creation, a thing is made out of nothingness of itself, but it isn't that there was an absolute nothingness. Supposing it is conceivable that there was absolutely no God, and the world suddenly jumped into existence out of nothing. No mind could possibly allow that. But with the idea of an omnipotent God as a first cause, we do accept. We could not have figured it out, but when it is revealed, we can accept it, and it's intelligent. But from there on, when change takes place, you have to find that it is not an absolute annihilation or an absolute coming into being out of nothing, but some potency in a real being has become actual. That all change has to involve a prior potency in something real. And there must be a subject that undergoes the change. When I say Joseph was a child and now Joseph is a man, what is the terminus a quo? That's the starting point. Now, get used to these terms because they will be occurring all the time. You can't talk philosophy without some new terms. I can promise you that they are not infinite. If you say a course in cosmology, how many new terms are we going to learn? Well, actually, absolutely, they are not absolutely new. We all talk about matter, we all talk about change. So we use them in a little more technical term. Some new terms like hylomorphism, I don't think you ever talked about it at breakfast. But I promise you the vocabulary is not infinite. Maybe 50, maybe 100, but it's just somewhere in that order. But you have to be learning it all the time. So I try to keep introducing these terms as we go on so that they will emerge out of actual experience, so that the whole thing doesn't become vacuous or verbiage, just words. So, what are the two terms I was introducing? Terminus a quo and terminus ad quem. Supposing we want to make a journey to Chicago. That involves a kind of change. What do we call it? Locomotion. That's a change of place. Hopefully the same persons who were in Still River are going to end up in Chicago. What's the terminus a quo? Still River. What's the terminus ad quem? Chicago. What is the subject that had been in Still River, but even in Still River had a potency to be in somewhere else, and is now in Chicago? That's the persons that made the trip. Do you get the idea now? So we have, in every change you have to discover the starting point, the terminal point, and the subjectum. Now, in every one of the changes I mentioned, the four kinds of change, how many kinds of change philosophy recognizes? Only four. Changes in place, in quantity, in quality, and in nature or substance. Things that will change the substance completely. In every one of them we have to discover those elements of all change. Now, in substantial change, take the paper I just had in my hand and suddenly I burned it. What's the terminus a quo? A paper. Is that a definite material substance? Yes. Does it have a definite nature? Is it recognizable? Do you know what you can do with paper and what you couldn't do? You could write on paper. Could you write on ashes? Could you write on smoke? Could you use smoke or vapor the way you use paper? You see what I mean by change of nature. A complete substance and a whole new nature has arisen. So, what's the terminus a quo? The paper. What's the terminus ad quem? Well, Lavoisier tells us, and he's the father of modern chemistry, that if you collect all the things that result when you burn the paper, they will weigh exactly what the paper itself weighed. So there is something that has continued. You see that? You get a sense of what the philosophers... So they're not just using words arbitrarily. There is something that has continued. Not too many people needed to perform the experiment of Lavoisier. I wonder if anybody even bothered to try it again. You think that when they come out with some universal statement as drastic as this, in all substantial change, the weight at the start should be the weight at the end, you think they would say we have to try it some million times, and even then they have proved it by way of induction. But because there is a very good a priori reason why it is so, the moment they found it in one case, everybody accepted it, and the whole scientific world has accepted it categorically after that. Something has continued. From the day of creation till today, something has continued all through the centuries. But it has taken on different substances all along. So, the terminus a quo is the paper. The terminus ad quem, ashes, smoke, vapor, etc. What is the subject that was paper and is now smoke and vapor and all these things, and ashes? What is that subject? That's what the philosophers call prime matter. Do you get the idea? Prime matter. Something has continued. Now, prime matter and substantial form, now not substantial here, now I'm talking about substantial form, are correlative. In every individual material substance, like the grain of sand in my finger, there is a composition of prime matter and substantial form. We see what the prime matter is. I said this grain of sand has not always existed. It could be 100 years old, it could be 1,000 years old, but it's not eternal. And it need not have existed at the creation on the first day. But the matter that's in it was created on the first day. And whatever else it has undergone throughout the centuries, the matter was always there. But what determines the same matter to be a grain of sand here and a dog with a wagging tail over there? What is the difference that determines that sheer potency that is prime matter to be a tree here, a rock there, an animal here, a tree there? That is what is called substantial form. So substantial form is not what we mean by, usually when we use the word form, we understand by it shape, right? Well, here we are using it in the philosophic sense. It's much deeper. I guess a substantial form can contribute in many cases a peculiar shape, like a tree. If it's pine tree, it tends to have some different shape from an apple tree and so on. But that's very accidental. That's not the essential meaning. Substantial form is a philosophic concept which means the determinant of prime matter to be this particular kind of thing. Every individual substance has a definite nature. Every individual material substance can be destroyed, but its matter cannot be destroyed. It can go on to be something else. But what makes it to be sand now is the substantial form of sand. You get the idea? I'm just trying to introduce some of the most elementary terms necessary for philosophic cosmology. Now, I will not exhaust the subject tonight, and I will be coming back to it again, but I hope I introduced the word contingent being. I don't think I will proceed to discuss it tonight. Have a kind of a deceptive simplicity, but that's why I suggest that after I discuss them with you here, after we read them together, you take some time and go over them and try to reason them out by yourself, to absorb everything that's in them. And that's why after I have read them last week, I was thinking about them all week. And now I come and just give you the fruit of how I was meditating on them. So now I am going to introduce the next meditation. It's called the mustard seed. A small mustard seed may be mistaken for a grain of sand. Every perfection which can be attributed to the grain of sand may be adapted so as to apply to the mustard seed. You could say of either entity that it is a natural body, existing in space and time. We shall see what we mean by space and time very soon. But everything has to be related back to first substance. When we come to talk about space and time, what does it mean in terms of the first substances? You see, that's the foundation of all Philosophia Perennis as far as cosmology is concerned. But anyway, existing in space and time, possessing a definite nature and contributing its part in maintaining the order of nature. I don't know of any philosophic insight more moving than the one where we saw that if every grain of sand could lose its nature suddenly and start behaving like water, that's the end of men, that's the end of history, that's the end of the countries of the world, of all. To see how much is depending on the faithfulness of nature in that grain of sand is one of the deepest insights. And when you have 1,000 insights like that, atheism becomes impossible. Absolutely. An intellectual impossibility. It's the minds that have not been trained to contemplate, to think intelligently and correctly, that become materialists or skeptics or so on, and just kind of resign all intelligence. So, but one perfection is in the seed and not in the sand, and what is it? Life. All right, so now we have gone over a new plane. We have stepped from the plane of minerals to the plane of living things. 2. The evolutionists want us to believe that, given sufficient time, a grain of sand or something like it, by mere chance, may begin to be alive. But the mustard seed has life because it comes from life, and nothing less could explain its living nature. If you take a stone, no matter how well shaped, like an egg, you can't expect it to become an egg in 1 minute or in a day or in a year. But if you give it 5 billion years, you don't know. It might suddenly become an egg. Life is not visible, nor can it be perceived by any sense power, although its effects may be perceived by the senses. But life is intelligible. Every time I underline a word, it means it's an important word. See how it is used. And you will be building up your philosophic vocabulary. You see what I mean by intelligible. Intelligible comes from intellect, as visible comes from sight, vision. When you say a thing is visible, it means you can see it with the eyes. When you say it's intelligible, it means you can see it with the intellect. You can understand it. Now the word in English, understand, has no relation with intellect, and so it doesn't give us that connection. But in Latin, they come. The noun and the verb come from the same root. So life is intelligible. It's not a sensible. Have you ever seen life? Have you ever weighed it? Have you ever tasted it? Have you ever smelled it? But the mind can't see it. You know exactly when you see a living thing, and you know how different it is from a non-living thing. And can also be defined. which is one of the greatest achievements of philosophy. Life can be exactly defined. The mustard seed is a living thing because its nature endows it with the power of, and I'm giving you the definition of life, immanent action. Immanent, remaining in the thing itself. That's what immanent means. What's the opposite of immanent? Transient. Transient. And we shall see how we use it. Transient. Transient, immanent, oppose each other. An action that begins and ends in the thing itself, and whose purpose is the perfecting of the thing itself. Now, anybody who pretends that he doesn't know the difference between a seed that can be put in the ground and start growing, and the grain of sand that you dig it in the ground and stay the grain of sand unless it dissolves into some other mineral. Well, if they don't see that much, they are not going to find God or find immortality or find any higher values. So that's why we have to sharpen and not discourage our intelligence. The vital action of a living thing proceeds from an intrinsic principle or cause and tends to a good or a perfection of the living thing itself. The grain of sand is capable of producing only transient actions, so that's another underlined phrase, whose good or purpose must be sought outside the nature of the reality of the sand, outside the nature or the reality of sand. You say, what is the purpose of sand? Or anything that sand can do. You say it's to help other sand being more sandy. Now you say, well, don't raise the question of purpose. There is no such thing as purpose. The overwhelming reality of purpose becomes so tremendous, then you have to resign all intelligence before you can get rid of it. Incidentally, here is an excellent example of how our human intelligence can penetrate through the visible or sensible phenomena, again another word underlined. We have all kinds of philosophies today that derive from this word phenomena, to apprehend an intelligible reality, life, and to give a definition of this reality in clear, understandable terms. What would be another word for understandable? Intelligible terms. 5. Every object of the non-living universe is capable only of transient actions. That is, it can only do something to something other than itself. A grain of sand can be depended upon to behave, to act in very definite ways, but the effects and the purpose are to be sought for in other things. As far as the grain of sand itself is concerned, all the powers and the inclinations of its nature are such as to make it serve purposes other than its own. The grain of sand acts for other beings, exists for other beings, and therefore its nature as such is servile. By definition, by its very nature. 6. But the mustard seed, as alive, has a purpose of its own, and given the opportunity, it begins to move itself and to put other things to its use. The mustard seed actually puts the entire rest of the universe at its service. Have you ever thought of that? The sun, the moon, the stars, the atmosphere, the wind, the clouds, the oceans, the seasons of the year and the cycles of the days, the different conditions of the weather, not to speak of the soil and humidity in immediate contact with it. From the point of view of quantity, the non-living things exceed by far the living. All the galaxies, billions of years, oh boy. From the point of view of quantity, the non-living things exceed by far the living. But in importance, all non-living beings serve what possesses life. By its very definition, a nature capable only of transient action is servile, and a servile nature is a means to an end. Another pair of two very important terms, means and ends. The end or purpose of non-living matter is to be at the service of life. This is the meaning of order, that's another important word, of order in the universe, because order is the adaptation of means to an end. I could talk an awful lot on order, but I'm not going to be distracted now. Let me continue. If in the entire universe there were to be found only one living thing, one tree, one flower, or even one blade of grass, that one living entity would, in relation to all non-living things, stand as queen. Now, if that first insight of how our very existence here depends on the faithfulness of every grain of sand to be what it is meant to be, that's another insight that adds up to it right away. If there were one blade of grass in a universe where nothing else is alive, everything would be serving it, and it would be putting them to use for its own purposes. Is the sun at the service of that blade of grass? You bet your life. The sun is doing nothing for itself, but it's making that thing alive and grow and so on. That's atmosphere, everything in the world. Now, you see how the tendency of all modern science has been to depreciate man, make us look now that we know man is not the center of the universe, as if that's the important thing, whether the sun is turning around the earth or the earth turning around this. What difference does it make? Or the galaxies, it's one of the minor stars, the sun is one of the minor stars, and the earth is not the biggest planet around it, and so what's man, all this depreciatory talk is the exact opposite of the outlook that God revealed and that intelligence, philosophical intelligence, would restore. A flower growing, how much time do you have? 5 minutes, good. A flower growing in a perspective of non-living objects is perhaps the frailest object in view. It is weaker than the soil, less permanent than the water, more perishable than the air, and less powerful than the light. That flower could not exist unless we first have the soil, the water, the air, and the light. But considered from the aspect of finality, another important word, finality, or end or purpose, they are synonyms, the flower is the end and purpose of the soil, the water, the air, and the light. So much so that the creative power which posited these things in existence would not have done it unless first intending to produce a flower, the one object in the perspective which has life. In a growing mustard plant, there are millions of physical and chemical processes going on, apparently according to their physical and chemical laws. Yet all these processes are in fact unified, simplified, and directed to a definite end by the same principle or reality which makes the seed to be mustard rather than any other substance that the quantity of matter in the seed could have been. Our minds ought to realize that there must be such a reality or principle before we ask the philosophers for its name. And when we ask them for its name, what do they say it is? Soul. There must be a soul in every plant. Now we shall see that the soul in man is more than a soul, it's also a spiritual soul. So when I say there are souls in plants, don't think that they are immortal souls. Certainly they are not rational souls, but they are principles of life. Is that the... do I have time? 5 more minutes? Oh, very good. If instead of a mustard seed, a seed of another kind were planted in the same soil, a different kind of plant would have been formed out of the same matter. Matter as such is indifferent, but once a mustard seed is chosen, a decision is made, and the indifference of matter is removed. The mustard seed is not some vague something you do not know what it is, nor what it's going to be or to do next. It would be so on the part of its matter alone. But it's a very definite something with a determined nature and with dependable behavior. There are 3 things a mustard seed can do and no inanimate object can. And what are the 3 vital activities of every living thing, even on the lowest plane, which is plant life? Nutrition, growth, and reproduction. We call these vital activities. They are immanent in the mastered thing itself. They begin and end in the mastered reality, and their purpose is obviously a mastered purpose. It's easy to see that nutrition and growth begin and end in the individual mastered plant. Mastered as individual or first substance. You see the use of that word, first substance. And that these two vital activities serve the life that is in the plant and aim at its perfection. But reproduction, the third and the consummate activity of the plant, seems to involve a transient activity ending in another individual substance. How is reproduction still a vital act? In what sense is it immanent? Yes, generation or reproduction is also a vital act, since it manifests a propensity of life to perpetuate itself. And considering that when life exists in matter, the individual is bound to die, another individual of the same nature must be produced. Thus, by naming the specific nature mastered, substance in the sense of second substance, so you see those two words we just introduced are very useful. In place of the individual substance, this master plant, we can say of the act of generation that it begins and ends in mastered, as life begets life. I will be thinking about this during the week, and next week I will have a few minutes of raving about what we just read, as I did this week with regard to the assignment of last week. In nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus.